So Josh, it is just the two of us now. A two-man maybe it's the yeah, exactly. Maybe it's the two of us, and maybe this would be the one time where threesomes with John and Josh is appropriate, because we've got Carly Simon in here, and there's a relatively famous story that she tells about. She was a member of a singing band with her sister, and they went on a trip with Sean Connery. And apparently the famous story that she tells from that is that Sean Connery wanted a Simon Sisters sandwich, but alas, she was not down for that. But her sister was down for a night with Mr. Bond. So it's funny that we were joking around with the title with that, because there actually is a story about a threesome that went awry from the 60s when Carly was just a young woman. So I thought I would share that because it did make me funny. But, you know, what Mr. Connery did not get, Josh and I will get in terms of intimacy with her music tonight in a segment to end our show. Sound good?
Sounds good. She's not keeping any secrets, that's for sure.
No, and this album is called No Secrets. Exactly. And it's certainly a confessional singer-songwriter album, and there's going to be, you know, one of the things about covering 1972 to 1973 is there is no shortage of female singer-songwriters confessional, and of course Carly Simon married James Taylor, who's the and dated Cat Stevens.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So oh, yes, dated Cat Stevens, was married to James Taylor for a very long time, I think throughout the most of the 70s and the early 80s. And I want to say dated somebody else who was, you know, it was kind of like, you know, an incestuous scene a little bit in that singer-songwriter world in the early 70s. So, but yes, she and James Taylor, you want to talk about the marriage, the crown marriage of singer-songwriters in the 70s. What would be the equivalent of that today if, like, Taylor Swift married Ed Sheeran or something? You know, like, would that be what we'd be looking at? Yeah. Just, you know, they both kind of write about their lives, right? So yeah, we'll go with that. Or if yeah. So, okay. But let's get into the segment after you run the numbers for us, because my guess is going to be this might be the highest rated album we've done tonight.
Actually, No Secrets, which came out in 1972, is in Best Ever Albums.
Okay.
The 63rd highest ranked album of 1972. It is 637 in the top albums of the 70s, and it is 3,550 in the best albums of all time master.
Oh,
rating.
Wow. Really not then?
Yep. And no listing, as we said in the previous segments, about Rolling Stone, and not in the 1,001 albums to listen to before you die.
Well, deep cuts abound tonight, Josh. So, but Carly Simon is not a deep cut in terms of name recognition. She is right at the top of the charts, I think, in terms of artists that people will know, even if they don't know anybody else that we've covered tonight. So, let's start from there, Josh. Is it possible to talk about the Carly Simon album without talking about the Carole King and the Joni Mitchell albums, or do we kind of have to talk about them as reference points?
I mean, that was my first note when listening to this album.
Yeah.
So she is by far the most recognizable of the four artists that we've listened to tonight and talked about. Right off the bat from this album, she's in that singer-songwriter vein again, and I got Carole King and Laura Nyro vibes right off the bat.
Good use of songs. Vein.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
That's the song that most people would know from this. Yes.
Yeah. Overall, You're So Vain is that. I mean, that is probably the monster hit. I mean, it is the monster hit of this album. Probably one of her biggest hits of her career, and unfortunately, I feel like nothing else on the album really meets the level of You're So Vain, and I really tried to pay attention to the lyrics listening to this album to kind of get a feel for what she was writing about or what she was trying to get off her chest. And she talks about family, backstory. She's talking about relationships. She's talking about having sex with a guy, and waiting so long, and she's no virgin, and she wrote a song that personifies my wife, Night Owl, and so all of those songs, there's nothing as catchy as You're So Vain. That is, I don't know, we didn't look up the backstory on the songwriting of that, if she had collaboration or if that was a solo work.
Well, it's like the most speculated. So in her, like, she did an autobiography a few years ago where I think she finally mentioned that like verse 2 was about Warren Beatty, and there's been rumors that it's about, like, I mean, one thing about Carly Simon, she dated many famous men, and I don't say that derisively, but I mean, one of the reasons her autobiography was so sought after was because she was sort of a highly desirable figure in the late 60s and early 70s for a lot of men. She had that, you know, not quite like Nico, like the opposite, actually. She had the sex appeal, but instead of being like a cold German sex kitten, she was more of like a passionate, earthy sex kitten, you know what I mean? And I only say that because you can't hear this album without hearing sex, because sex drips all over this album. It's clearly a large part of the intimacy and relationships that Carly Simon talks about. Certainly more than Joni Mitchell and Laura Nyro and Carole King were talking about. You know what I mean? They were, yeah. I mean, Joni Mitchell talked about sex, right? But she didn't talk about it in, you know,
yeah, she,
you know, in so many different ways.
Yeah, Carly Simon is talking about relationships and sex and love in a different way than the other people that we've talked, like Joni Mitchell and them, that we've talked about. It's kind of a more, I don't know, like almost a like free spirit, carnal way. I was referencing You're So Vain, not really the background of the lyrics, but more of like,
oh, gotcha.
Did she write that song, or did a songwriter write that and give it to her, or something like that?
No, she writes her own stuff, and hence the No Secrets is basically, you know, I know that the origin story, I can remember seeing an interview with her where she had mentioned the fact that she spent quite a bit of time in therapy. I mean, she had a somewhat traumatic childhood with, you know, all of the things that you would think, you know, grew up as like, you know, upper middle class, upper class, you know, icy father who died young, you know, there was some, well, it's like sexual abuse that she's not sure if it was sexual abuse, because when she was young, you know, it was like a teenage boy type deal, and she had you know what I mean? A lot of those conflicted things. And, you know, she's very honest about that. And like the No Secrets was designed as like, you know, she has that very confessional, just like Joni Mitchell, right? Where, who was it, like David Crosby or somebody said like, whoa, you can keep a little bit of it back, right? You know, no, it was Chris Christopherson, right? Wasn't that who said that?
Talking about Joni Mitchell, yeah.
Yeah, well, and Joni Mitchell, if you remember, she did write that one song about traveling abroad and, you know, having some carnal experience, but it was one song in the larger narrative, right? Whereas like with Carly Simon, you get the feeling that like if you weren't having good sex, if Carly Simon didn't feel you were having good sex, right? You know what I mean? Like you were not going to have a relationship. And I just, that's just, you know, that's a viewpoint, you know what I mean? And like for some people, they're so tied together. And like that was what I took from the lyrics here, that there was like a intimacy, sex, and love and closeness were all so intricately tied together. They were not teased apart like they were in the other female singers, and even the James Taylor albums, right? You know,
yeah. What do you think about? I mean, I don't know really any of her work beyond maybe some of the bigger hits, but
I know a fair amount. Yeah,
this is kind of like in the early part of her career. I think she looks like she had a couple of albums before this, and I don't know if this is the peak. I guess probably the 80s or late 70s would probably be her peak in terms of popularity. But
well, I think this was her highest selling album, but she was a big star throughout the 70s and was able to transition into the 80s in like more of like an adult contemporary way. The 70s, you know, she sort of rode out most of the 70s as a, you know, top tier in terms of popular female songwriter, you know. I think one thing that stands out to me is that I don't connect with her thematically like I did with certainly Carole King and even to a degree Joni Mitchell. Like, and I was trying to think, is it because the viewpoint is so decidedly feminine? But I really don't think that's what it is, because I compare it a little bit to that Rod Stewart album, And where I didn't connect to that at all either. Because, like, God bless Rod Stewart, but he was living in a way that, like, in his relationship, in no way they resembled, like, how I imagined my relationships go. And since all he's writing about is relationships, right? Like, you kind of have to say, it's like I'm detached from it. But unlike the Joni Mitchell album, where I felt like there were parts of it that weaved with things I could understand and parts that were different, and you would weave in and out while listening to her narrative, Carly Simon seemed like a very exciting, introspective woman that would be, you could see why she'd be good to know, but like no part of how she experiences relationships, I think, lines up with my own personal experience. Like that wearing your heart so deeply on your sleeve and just feeling so, so deeply, and an observational way of looking at things. That's a big thing with her music. She's very aware of like the visuals and observational, the sensory experience. And so from that end of things, I've used the term voyeuristic before, but can you really be voyeuristic? Can you be a voyeur if someone's having sex directly in front of you when you're walking past them? You know what I mean? Is that being a voyeur, or is that just, stumbling into someone exposing themselves, And that's where I feel it's different. This is someone laying it bare, and it's admirable how honest she was, especially for a woman in the early 70s, right? But it didn't jive with... I also think that voice-wise, I've never really thought Carly Simon has a great voice. And I think that stood out to me as well. I don't know.
Certainly not compared to Carole King.
Right, and I don't want to even compare her, because I there's people whose voice connects with me more and less, and people who I don't necessarily love their voice, but I can recognize they have a good voice. People who I don't necessarily think they have a good voice, but I like it. It's not so much that she's not on tune or anything. It's just sort of, it passes by me, Carly Simon's voice, and it doesn't transcend the songs to some degree. And I think that's what I struggled with a little bit. So I'll be honest with you, I'll lay my cards down, Josh. I didn't love this album all that much. It's impossible to tell the story of the 70s without talking about Carly Simon, which is why I'm so glad that we're talking about her. But she doesn't feel as essential to me as Carole King or Joni Mitchell did, or even some of the male singer-songwriters that we've talked about, and most notably her husband, James Taylor. We may not have loved that album, but I didn't feel that the album was as... I know Matt would probably differ with me, but I didn't feel the James Taylor album was as disposable as to some degree this album was.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat with you. I didn't really enjoy this album much beyond You're So Vain. I thought there'd be maybe more songs, more upbeat songs like You're So Vain. That just kind of stands head and shoulders above the rest of the album, and as a result, the rest of the album is kind of disappointing to me. I did listen to this album while on Spotify, but on my TV. So they have the Spotify app gives you like facts and things. And stories while you're listening, if you're interested. And did you know that Mick Jagger sings backing vocals on You're So Vain? Did you hear him?
Yes, I do know the story of that. Actually, he was trying to woo Miss Simon, and he just showed up at the studio and offered his services. I feel like for a large part of the origin story and the mystique of Carly Simon is just the amount of highly desired men who just went batshit. You know what I mean? Like she had Mick Jagger's like super fucking sex id, banging down the doors for her. Warren Beatty's like nonstop libido. Sean Connery. Yeah, Mr. I Feel It. James Taylor. These are all. I know Matt calls James Taylor beta, but he had his own alpha charisma. You know what I mean in terms of drawing in women too. These are all like super alpha men, right? And they are just batshit crazy for Carly Simon. So I said Nico must have had the good, but I feel like Carly Simon in particular had the good that people were looking for. You know what I mean? And it's that I think it's that like smoldering passion. She's very attractive, but not in like a traditional way, right? And I think there's just something about that smoldering feeling that you hear in her songs, that she lays it all out there, feel that really just clicked with men and women of this era. And do you think we would experience this album, Josh, differently if we were? I know we ask this whenever we cover albums by female artists, right? And we're probably going to have to ask questions like this whenever we cover anyone, you know, like when we're talking about hip hop and stuff. And I know with Matt, and we've talked about, you know, him coming from, by his own admission, a place that was not super diverse. Like, how is he hearing R&B and soul? Like, what's the context, right? Because a lot of Matt is what he's experienced and stuff. And if you weren't in part of it, you're hearing everything isolated, right? Whereas I grew up hearing, you know, R&B as much as I grew up hearing rock. You know, it just was the part of the idea that some of this stuff is unfamiliar is bizarre. You know, I think you're a little bit more in my camp, right? In some ways, in terms of experiencing it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to answer your question,
what do you think?
I think that, I guess it's hard to see. I don't know. I don't see kind of what the appeal of this album is beyond her, I guess, her kind of star power and magnetism. I don't think that comes through on the album, but maybe it was just refreshing for people at the time to hear that on an album. I didn't.
Well, you know, men like to hear men sing about sex. Do you think it could be that, you know, this was because, like we said before, who's the market for female artists at this time, right? You had, if we're talking African American artists, you know, we're still at the spot where they're not speaking. They're speaking more frankly than most white artists, but they're not speaking, you know, as explicitly maybe as it is here, right? When we listen to that Joni Mitchell album, she's on the fray, but Joni Mitchell also, she's got a powerful feminism to her, but it's not necessarily a feminism that's tied into that sexuality. You know, Carole King is writing about friendship and writing about dissolutions of marriages. It's that Carole King album, when you look back at it, is kind of a sexless album in some ways. Do you think it's just that she's writing about sex in a more explicit way? And, you know, even for maybe women who are not themselves in that, like many men, you know what I mean, reading and stuff, it still is intriguing to read about someone sort of more self-actualized than themselves in that realm. Because like I said, that lyrically, that is what stands out. You know, even in You're So Vain, she says, like, you know, she's writing about her, you had me when I was young and naive, right? And now, like, I can hold my own a little bit more and tell you that you're like a naive prick, right? You know, as opposed to just someone who was overtaken by your sexual charisma. You know, that's a constant theme on this album. I don't mean to oversell the sex, but this, in many ways, this album is just as much sex and the intimacy that derives from it and relationships that are built on it and the loss of it as, you know, something like the. Have we really covered an album that's as much about relationships and sex as much as this one is? Because we've covered sex-stripped albums, but, you know, like, what do you think?
I'd have to look back.
Am I being too much in that lane?
No, I don't know. I'd have to look back at the list to see really what is similar to that. I guess I don't listen to albums for that sort of reason. So I guess ultimately the music isn't strong enough on this album for me to make it rise above kind of where it is in the rankings, especially compared to the other artists, singer-songwriter artists that we've talked about. I'm quickly looking through the list now, and I don't really see anybody similar to kind of what she's doing. So I guess maybe somebody like Loretta Lynn, maybe not as blatantly sexual.
I hear what you're saying,
as
though.
Carly Simon, but also kind of like telling it like it is, and Dolly Parton's kind of the same way too. I think she was also like
Roberta Flack a little bit nodded to it as well. Mm-hmm. If you remember, there was that song about the older man, you know, where it was about the deep connection there. But yeah, I mean, I think of like someone 30 years later, like Liz Phair, who wrote very explicitly about relationships and sex and intimacy and either not feeling she has it and stuff. And, you know, the PJ Harvey, who, I mean, and those two they come from a different singer-songwriter tradition than this.
Lisa Loeb.
But they covered lyrically. Yes, although she was more precious in how she, you know, this is, and in fairness, Liz Phair and PJ Harvey were like more like dirty, uncomfortable, you know, whereas Carly Simon's was not coming from a, you know, dirty, it was more of like a, you know, I want to lay in bed with you all day, you know, because I'm so in love with you type. Whereas like, you know, Liz Phair wrote a song called Fucking Run, you know what I mean? So it's like a different type of discussion of it. But I think that's what is so interesting to me, because the male singer-songwriters, you know, whether it be a cliche or not, are not talking about that subject. I mean, who have we done? Cat Stevens and Paul Simon and James Taylor. I mean, they're not writing they're writing relationship songs, but they're not covering sort of that, you know? They're more in sort of like the world and philosophical questions and despair and, you know, in the context of relationships, the highs and the lows emotionally. So, but I guess going back to it, it just didn't rise above mediocre for me. And I'm sorry to say that, because I know lots of people who love Carly Simon, and it was a big part of, you know, their listening, and they still enjoy her stuff. And she's certainly a very interesting character, but this album didn't do it for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of the same way. I'm a little surprised considering how much you seem to get out of the album in terms of seeing kind of all the themes and stuff. But at the end of the day, that wasn't enough, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think it's more that it's to some degree Carly Simon, the personality almost overwhelms Carly Simon, the artist, at times, because a lot of what I know about Carly Simon is not even her music. I know it's about the relationships and just different anecdotes she has, and, you know, books she's written and reinventions, and, you know, she's just as much in the public in terms of her. You know, she'll give interviews, you know, and she's always got tasty tidbits about people, and you know what I'm saying? She just seems to know everybody. And so as of that, she sort of like transcends the musical genre, because she's here, there, and everywhere. And gosh, I'm trying to think of any other musical artists like that. I mean, there's people whose music and their personality like that are equal, you know, like Mick Jagger and Madonna and people like that. But I'm trying to think of somebody who is that much a part of the culture with, and then they're also a famous musician, but they're almost more well known for being famous than they are a musician at times. Yeah,
that's usually reserved for that, like kind of actors or actresses in movies more than singers. I'd have to think about that. That's an interesting take, though. Yeah, and she kind of is like that. But you're exactly right, Josh. It's more something I think of with like actors and actresses than singers. And it's hard to just say, because I mean, she has like Nobody Does It Better, and, you know, in the 80s, Let the River Run, and, you know, You're So Vain. Pretty much everybody knows that song. So it's not like she didn't have hits, and there's others too. I just went, you know, right there with three that most listeners would know. So it's not like she's some obscure artist. It's not like she's obscure. You know, she did, you know, it's interesting because I did a little bit of bio for this, and she said that she did write that song hoping that even though Sean Connery was not Bond anymore, who would it have been in that era? Roger Moore. Was he Bond? Yeah. So she wrote it hoping that Connery would hear that and remember their time on the boat. And it's funny because then you think to yourself, well, what does she want him to remember? You know what I mean? Because it's a, you know, so it's, and then it goes back into kind of this idea that, like, you know, Carly Simon's sort of like a provocative sex kitten, you know what I mean? A little bit, but like in control of her, you know, sexual appeal, you know? So, and so, I don't mean to sound obsessed with sex. That's not what I'm going for, but it's impossible to hear this. Like, we even talked about it before this. If you look at the covers of Carly Simon's albums, they are including this one, including this one. This is a very, in its own, it's exactly what I would say about Carly Simon. It's not a trashy sexualness, but you look at the album and, you know, you notice that, you know, she is not trying to fold into the background for
two in particular reasons, I would say, reasons that you know that. But
Yeah.
I would let listeners themselves check it out and see what you think, and then look at, on something like Spotify or Apple Music, take a look at the albums all the way up through the early '90s, because each of the covers, there is a hint of sexuality for the most part on them. So in different ways, though, sort of like different angles. So
Yeah, it kind of evolves too, I think.
Yes, it evolves both in terms of like what type of feeling you're supposed to get, and also like every 5 years as the culture changes, like the look and the clothes and the haircut and stuff, and the all, it's like, all right, this is early 70s Carly, now she's late 70s Carly, now there's early 80s Carly, each one, like, it's like, okay, we could lay them up and say like which era was this in, and you could probably pick, this is the early 80s, this is the early 90s, this is late 70s.
Yeah,
they're a little on the nose.
Hairstyles change, hair gets bigger, clothes change on the albums. So,
absolutely. So yeah, I might have to give this one a thumbs down, Josh. I was not a huge fan of this one.
Yeah, I'm kind of same. I'm probably more negative than even middling. So, just listen to "You're So Vain," I think, if you haven't heard that song.
And I apologize, Carly. I'm sure you would have been still are, probably a very interesting person to know. And especially in the early 70s, I'm pretty sure that you would have been a person that Josh and I both would have loved to have known for a variety of reasons. If for no other reason, then you would have had a hell of a lot of stories to tell us. So
yeah, that's for sure.
So keep doing your thing. So, and God bless you for being married to James Taylor that long. I'll put that in there for Matt, because from everything I heard, that was quite a challenging relationship, the two of them. So,
and then she married another James. That's crazy.
Oh, I don't know who that James is. James Hart. Should I know who James Hart is?
I don't think so. I don't
Okay.
know what his role is. I just saw that in the Wikipedia bio.
Still married, or?
Nope, divorced in 2007.
Unlucky in love, unfortunately. She and many of the artists we've covered, unlucky in love, Josh.
Yeah.
I feel like that is something that there aren't a lot of like 40-year marriages, right? In music, and those that do actually usually were married before they found their person to be married to for 30 years. So
yeah,
do you think
that's a whole
maybe that's an essential question. Yeah.
I was just about to say, yeah. I would have said
like
that's an essential question that needs researching.
Well, Paul McCartney, he had those, famous, before he got married, right? But he seemed pretty dedicated to Linda when he was there. But the rest of the Beatles obviously had their ups and downs. The Stones, not so much. Yeah, well, we'll talk about that later. But yeah, I almost feel like you need to have a little bit of a different view of committed relationships in music, certainly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, to kind of make it so. Yeah. And we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.